Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the IPCC event, the key findings of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report in light of recent developments and outlook of the 7th assessment cycle. My name is Ermira Fida. I am the Deputy Secretary of the IPCC and I am going to be the moderator for today's IPCC event. I'm here today with the IPCC chair, the vice chairs, and the co-chairs of working group. I'm going to introduce them as we move along with the agenda. This event reflects on the opportunities for the 7th cycle of IPCC in the context of the recent developments and the outlook and the findings of the 6th assessment report. As you all know, IPCC has completed the 6th assessment cycle in July this year, following the elections of the new chair and the bureau. It has been the busiest cycle in the IPCC's history, with a record number of the report. Just to mention them, 3 working group assessment reports, 3 special reports, a methodology report, and a synthesis report. In 6 weeks from now, the panel will meet in Istanbul, Turkey, to discuss the program of work and the materials of the 6th assessment cycle. The recent events, extreme weather events, greenhouse gas emission trends, the current adaptation and mitigation policies, and the financial flows since the publication of the 6th assessment report have led to questions about the current climate and the future warming levels. And of course, questions such as, are the extreme weather events consistent with the AR6 findings? Could we be approaching critical physical thresholds or tipping points? Can we still effectively adapt to the risks to climate and human systems? Is limiting warming to 1.5 still achievable? And whether there are key relevant knowledge gaps and needs from policymakers are the questions that are coming up. And today's IPCC event is organized with a view to reflect on the developments, recent developments, and try to respond to these questions. The chair of the IPCC, in a few minutes, will present the vision of the IPCC's 7th assessment cycle and the work towards the work program development. He will then hand over to the vice chair, Diana Urge-Vorsatz, who will chair the role of the vice chairs and the contribution to the assessment cycle. I take this opportunity to thank her for coordinating and organizing and outlining this event. Then working group co-chairs will reflect on the recent climate-related development based on the AR6 key findings and the outlook of AR7. This event is live streamed. We have presenters who are online, who have also plans to co-share the presentation with the co-chairs. And before we start, I would like to remind the speakers for sticking on the time for their contribution as to allow the participants to ask questions and to engage properly with the speakers. And now I am going to start by giving the floor to the chair of IPCC, Professor Jimsky, who will be sharing, as I said, the vision for the 7th assessment cycle. Jim, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Ermira, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think, as Ermira has suggested, the 6th cycle of IPCC is going to be a hard act to follow. Under the leadership of my predecessor, Hoesung, IPCC delivered some of the most impactful reports in its 35-year history. And now in 2023, well on the way through this current decade of climate action, we actually face new challenges to deliver robust science in the light of manifest gaps in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and finance. And in setting out my vision for IPCC during the earlier part of this year, there were 3 themes that I focused on. And the first, perhaps the one that's most relevant here at COP28, was policy relevance. And globally, the key is how we interact with the UNFCCC. And we're actually honoured by the amount of attention given to IPCC and IPCC findings in the COP28 documentation, and in particular the documentation for the global stocktake. And we're also acutely aware that this brings with it responsibilities to produce robust scientific findings on which people can rely. Looking forward, we are particularly conscious of the need for timely reports which can inform, for example, the second global stocktake due to end in 2028. But we also need to generate action-oriented findings relevant to governments and other stakeholders who will deliver climate action. The second theme I focused on was interdisciplinarity, and to make this a bit clearer, I'm referring to collaboration between IPCC's 3 working groups and the Task Force on Inventories. And just to say, we made an excellent start in the last cycle when I was privileged to be Working Group 3 co-chair, and I can see that the new Working Group co-chairs are making an excellent start in that respect in preparing options for the 7th cycle. But I'm also referring to the other global crises we face on biodiversity and pollution, for example, and I'm determined to foster stronger links with our sister UN assessments such as IPBES and the International Resources Panel, and hopefully the new Chemicals and Waste Panel. Again, we made a start in the last cycle, but we aim to do more while operating within our own distinct mandate. My final theme was inclusivity, and this covers issues of gender, regional balance, and country representation. And just to say that gender balance in IPCC has improved over the years, but we can do better. In the last cycle, about 30% of participants in IPCC were women, and now 40% of the new bureau elected by governments earlier this year are women. And for the first time, we have a working group 3 on mitigation, co-chaired by 2 women together. And I cannot help but flag that we actually have a majority of women on the panel this evening. So there we have 60% in success. Now, in terms of regional balance and participation of younger scientists, the proportion of IPCC authors from developing countries has been steadily rising over time. And in the last cycle, I'm pleased to say that for the first time, there was actually a report, the Special Report on Climate Change and Land, where a small majority of authors came from developing countries. And that was due to scientific competence. It wasn't due to managing quotas. But we can do more to advance younger scientists from developing countries. In the last cycle, we ran an open competition in Working Group 3 for younger scientists from developing countries to participate directly in IPCC as chapter scientists. That is, providing essential support for authors in drafting chapters. Now, we surveyed the young people afterwards, and we're pleased to hear of positive outcomes in terms of participation in global networks, co-authored publications, and a general boost in terms of career development. And we're looking at ways of rolling out the scheme further in the 7th cycle, subject to the approval of governments. And finally, country representation. We do need to pay attention to the distribution of authors within regions so that writing teams are not dominated by those from large countries with strong institutions. And this is a message we've heard from several parts of the world. This needs attention at the selection stage for authors, but we also need to encourage countries to come forward with nominations, perhaps consulting other ministries such as those responsible for education and training. Now, turning to the 7th cycle specifically, we have yet to settle the programme of work. We will produce a special report on climate change in cities, and hopefully this can be concluded by 2026 or not much later. But the rest are going to be settled at the first plenary session of IPCC, which takes place in Istanbul in about 6 weeks' time. We have conducted a survey of governments, and the Bureau, and especially the Working Group co-chairs, have made a great start by structuring the options available. Relevance for the UNFCCC process, including the Paris Agreement and the second global stocktake, is a key consideration. And we will, of course, be paying careful attention to the outcomes of this COP28. Now, I might also say at this stage that equity has come to the fore as a major issue for IPCC, both scientifically and in terms of policy relevance. Towards the end of the last cycle, we held an IPCC workshop on scenarios and modelling, And a key message that was directed both to the scientific community and the IPCC specifically was that more attention to equity was required in terms of scientific substance, inclusiveness in research projects, right from their inception, and membership of key steering and advisory bodies. And just one last point before I close. IPCC is much bigger than any individual. And following advice from governments at the end of the last cycle, we have actually assigned specific roles to the 3 vice chairs of IPCC to look after issues such as publications, gender action, links with other UN assessments, links with UNFCCC, and links with stakeholder groups. You will hear from Anna Urge-Vorsatz in a second, who's going to speak on behalf of all 3 vice chairs, I think, here. But I'll just acknowledge Ladislaus Zhang and Ramon Pix Madruga, sitting in the front row here, who've already been playing a big role here at COP28. But for now, thanks for your attention. And like you, I look here forward to hearing more about knowledge gaps as well as key findings once we get on to the working group co-chairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for sharing the vision for the 7th cycle. I note the 3 keywords: policy relevance, interdisciplinary, and inclusivity. And on that note, I would like to pass the floor, as you have mentioned, to the Vice Chair, Professor Diana Urge-Vorsatz, who will share the information and the updates on the role on the role of the vice chairs during the 7th assessment cycle, and she's going to do that on behalf of the other 2 vice chairs. Diana, the floor is over to you.
Thank you, Ermira, and thank you, Jim. So, as already mentioned, I would like to give a very short presentation on the role of the vice chairs, who are all here. So I'm giving this on behalf of all 3 of us. So just to introduce them, so Ladislaus, do you mind standing up, please? We have Ladislaus Zhang from the United Republic of Tanzania. We are also really privileged to have Ramon Pix Madruga from Cuba. Unfortunately, it was not possible to put 2 more chairs on the podium, which is a pity, but they equally participate in the discussion, so I do hope that you will have questions to them as well in the discussion session. So just following up on what Jim already outlined, I just want to highlight how we are actually walking the talk and how we are assisting the chair, since that's our role to assist the chair in implementing his vision and the IPCC to ensure the integrity of the next cycle, how we are doing that amongst ourselves. So first of all, some of the major roles related to inclusivity and diversity, as Jim already mentioned. So Ladislaus is going to work on engaging more with the young scientists. I'm going to head the gender action team, and in fact in that we are also not only looking at gender but in general inclusivity and diversity, and we are very happy to say that in the next year we are going to have an expert meeting on this topic. Also, Ramon Pix Madruga will chair the Publications Committee, which is really important to ensure that our publications are also translated in all the main UN languages and many other tasks related to our reports. And finally, Ladislaus will run the Conflict of Interest Committee. Now, Jim mentioned that in this cycle we have a special emphasis on coordinating with the different UNFCCC bodies and also other assessments. Within that, I am going to oversee how we are engaging with different UN environmental assessments and programs. Nevertheless, since there are so many that we definitely share this role amongst ourselves. So Ramon Pix Madruga is going to be liaising with IPBES, GO7, UNCCD, Science and Policy Interface, while Ladislaus Zhang with the World Climate Research Program and WMO United in Science, among others, and I will be liaising with the International Resource Panel and the UN UNEP gap report. And as other reports or others come in, we are also going to share that amongst ourselves. With regard to outreach, also we are sharing it all amongst ourselves, but Ladislaus Zhang is going to coordinate. He also already has a long history with the UNFCCC constituted bodies, and he will provide the overview, and we share the different bodies amongst ourselves as is on the screen. So in terms of the UNFCCC constituencies, Ramon Pix Madruga will have an overview, so if you want us engaged in something else, please turn to him. But here is how we are going to be dividing our roles in terms of who will get in touch with which body. Finally, as Jim already mentioned, we also have a very strong emphasis, and you will hear this also in the talks of presentations of the co-chairs, a strong collaboration among the working groups, and we will try to be one of the ambassadors to make this coordination happen better. So with that, thank you very much, and now we are going to hear more from the actual working group co-chairs.
Thank you, Diana, for sharing information on the shared roles and responsibilities among the three of you. And with that, I would like to now move to the key reflections according to the program of the event. And as I mentioned earlier, we are now going to present each and every working group. Couple of co-chairs is going to share reflections on recent climate-related developments based on the AR6 key findings and the outlook for AR7. And we'll start now with Working Group 1 co-chairs, two co-chairs who are now participating online, Dr. Robert Vautard and Professor Xiaoye Zhang. They are going to take us through the key findings from the Working Group 1 report, as well as the outlook for AR7 in the context of recent developments. I know that Robert is going to start, will be the first one, and I will help with the moving of the slides, Robert. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. And probably I will need the slides to be projected.
They are being projected, Robert.
They are projected.
Oh, oops.
They don't see.
I'm sorry. Then this is fine. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, good evening. It is a pleasure for my fellow co-chair Xiaoye Zhang and myself to present our view from Working Group 1, which is actually progressively building. Can we go to slide number 2, which shows the books? Yes, thank you. To start with, I would like to mention that the AR6 Working Group 1 contribution, which goes actually well beyond the books which are shown here, was extremely complete thanks to the previous team and authors and TSUs as well. The initial question, which is already a challenge for building a vision, is what more can AR7 provide? So there will be more, but there will be also differences. We will be trying to explain that. Next one, please. So the vision that can be built for AR7 lies at the crossing between what the community plans, and this has been discussed recently at the WCRP meeting in Kigali in October, and what the governments need, as well as from the lessons learned from AR6. More integration across working groups, and we are committed to that. Solutions-oriented products, even for Working Group 1, more packed and focused reports, less workload for authors and TSUs. Next one, please. So since AR6, climate change has further developed, and we have observed in plain what it means in all regions of the world, and with many out-of-scale events, heat waves such as in British Columbia in the upper left corner of the figure in 2021, which was completely outstanding, or Canada fires this year, or in South Asia in this year also with very strong humid heat waves during the spring, fires, floodings, or even see the surprising sea ice extent in the Antarctic lately. So next one, please. So all these events are absolutely in line with AR6 results for hot extremes, for heavy precipitation, and will likely provide an even more complete picture to the figures on the left-hand side, which shows that climate change effects on extremes can now be attributed in almost all regions of the world. Likely, more regions will be covered and also more event types. These events, when considered by climate projections, also provide key understanding for what to expect from mitigation. It is on the right-hand side of the slide. It explains that, in particular, we are expecting with low mitigation on many regions in the tropics for which humid heat extremes will be unbearable. Next one, please. More broadly, we will have to explain in detail recent regional and global evolutions via the various anthropogenic and natural forces, and also natural variability. Some of these observed evolutions may challenge models in some regions, and a large body of science is currently taking place. We will also need to better identify critical region thresholds and global warming levels for which tipping points could take place, or climate drivers that would trigger ecosystems or social systems tipping points. Such tipping elements are schematically represented in the figure. Then, next one, please. The planet is not anymore a natural planet and undergoes anthropogenic pressures from all over the place. Together with the other working groups, we will have to organize the assessment of complex topics with inputs from several working groups, such as the carbon cycle under the pressure of climate change and land degradation, and the consequence of remaining carbon budgets. Another central topic is the managed water cycle with feedbacks between water use and regional climate. Understanding overshoot scenarios as well, what they mean, and how the climate responds to various types of interventions also is going to be important. Next one, please. Before handing the floor to my colleague. So for the assessment report, we are currently working hard together with a group of co-chairs to design a common vision and how these interfaces will show up in the final products. For Working Group 1 in particular, the interfaces will be also on scenarios, CEMIP scenarios, in particular, and with Working Group 2 we will work on the regional description of climate change together with a potential common and hopefully common atlas together between Working Group 1 and 2. And there are many other topics also. And I'm giving the floor to my colleague Xiaoye now for the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I hope you will hear me well. Next, please. Continuing with the problem. And we have a lot of things need to cover the 3 working group. Warming level, that's one of the keywords in the working group. This is also the scientific links to the amount of and working group 1 hope, working group 3, and the new scenario. And we can use them into our model, better warming level projection. And working group 2 also wait on working group 1 for atlas further assessment. And 3 await work 1 level result and assessment. Need a new scenario. And also they need our working group 1 to have for their email later. This just to show you something key. From the working group wish, and we think we need more focused assessment report, and that will increase the policy relevance and work for the answer. So the more co-design work I need among, for example, even the working group 1, even start after working group 3. And we also need even the system group to start first with the scoping, scoping together. Next, please. And other consideration about inclusion of the brain intelligence knowledge and the inclusive and also in the practitioner scoping. And we also consider carbon more of the AI. And this is the last slide from our working plan. We hope we will bring relevant information among and also consider diversified plans. Thank you for your attention. Over to the chair.
Thank you, Working Group 1 co-chairs, for your presentation, noting the alignment of the extreme events with the AR6 findings, your shared vision for AR7 and some ideas about the knowledge gaps, I would like to now hand over to Working Group 2 co-chairs. And we'll start with Winston Chow, Dr. Winston Chow, who is going to start, and he is going to make it together with Professor Bart and Hurk, who is going to do that online.
Thank you, Ermira. Let's see now, the slide deck should be available, I hope.
Yes, after this, just press.
Got it, thank you. So, good evening, everyone. I'm Winston Chow, Professor of Urban Climate at Singapore Management University, and together with Dr. Bart and Hurk, who is online, that handsome gentleman there, the Scientific Director at Vautard in the Netherlands. We are the co-chairs of Working Group 2, the working group that examines climate impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. I will be pointing out some key Working Group 2 related aspects of the AR6 synthesis report, published earlier this year, for the first half of this presentation. In other words, telling the bad news, before Bart takes over to talk about what we have in store for AR7 over the next 5 to 7 years. To start, approximately 3.3 to 3.6 billion people globally live in contexts highly vulnerable to climate change. Increasing weather and climate extreme events have exposed millions of people to acute food insecurity and reduced water security, and the largest adverse impacts observed in many communities in Africa, Asia, Central and South America, less developing countries, small island states, and the Arctic, and globally for indigenous peoples, small-scale food producers, and low-income households, resulting in many communities being displaced. In all regions, health and well-being has been impacted by climate change. The occurrence of climate-related foodborne and waterborne diseases, as well as the incidence of vector-borne diseases, have increased. In assessed regions, some mental health challenges have caused adverse impacts on human health, livelihoods, and key infrastructure, particularly to economically and socially marginalized urban residents. Urban infrastructure, including transportation, water, sanitation, and energy systems, have been compromised by extreme and slow onset climate impacts, with resulting economic losses and disruption of services. Globally, climate change has caused substantial damages and increasingly irreversible losses in terrestrial, freshwater, cryospheric, and coastal and open ocean ecosystems. Impacts on some ecosystems are approaching irreversibility, such as the impacts of hydrological changes resulting in glacial retreat, or the changes in some mountain and Arctic ecosystems driven by permafrost thaw. The worrying thing is this, that since the synthesis report was published, all these impacts that I've mentioned have continued to be observed and reported in multiple regions, countries, and communities over the past 10 months. The bad news is that the observed impacts we've attributed in AR6 are going to get worse as global temperatures increase. Every increment of global warming will intensify multiple and concurrent hazards. With further warming, every region is projected to increasingly increase concurrent and multiple changes in climatic impact drivers. For instance, annual hottest day temperature changes will worsen globally and can be exacerbated by local urban and regional heating, such as through El Nino. We've seen a lot of these incidences this past year. Other climate impacts that are compounded, such as heat waves and droughts, are also projected to become more frequent, including concurrent events across multiple locations. Regardless, for any future warming level, these climate-related risks are higher in AR6 as assessed in AR5, and projected long-term impacts are up to multiple times higher than currently observed. Risks and projected adverse impacts and related losses and damages from climate change will escalate for every increment of global warming. These are higher for global warming at 1.5 degrees C than at present, and even higher at 2 degrees Celsius, so that urgency is of great concern. Future exposure to climatic hazards is increasing globally due to socio-economic development trends, including migration, growing inequality, and urbanization. In cities, for instance, increased human vulnerability will concentrate in informal settlements and rapidly growing smaller settlements. Loss of ecosystems and their services has cascading and long-term impacts on people globally, especially for indigenous peoples and local communities who are directly dependent on ecosystems to meet basic needs. A concerning and emerging aspect of our assessment is that climatic and non-climatic risks will increasingly interact, creating compound and cascading risks that are more complex and difficult to manage and adapt to. For instance, climate-driven food insecurity and supply instability are projected to increase with increasing global warming, interacting with non-climatic risk drivers such as competition for land between urban expansion and food production, pandemics and conflicts, as we've seen today. So what can be done? Near-term action in terms of different levels of adaptation to climate-driven impacts has been assessed to significantly reduce climate risks, with proactive adaptation management, such as higher investment in health systems, being more effective in risk reduction. Delayed adaptation will further increase losses and damages, and additional human and natural systems will reach adaptation limits. Challenges from delayed adaptation actions includes the risk of cost escalation, lock-in of infrastructure, stranded assets, and reduced feasibility and effectiveness of adaptation options. The challenges facing risk and vulnerability reduction are stark. But, and this is the important thing, there are multiple opportunities for scaling up climate action. In particular, without stealing the thunder of my working group 3 co-chairs, those actions that integrate adaptation and mitigation towards that particular end of systemic changes enhancing transformation adaptation, along with rapid and deep emission reductions, can work. This systemic change may be unprecedented in terms of scale, but not necessarily in terms of speed, in order to limit the excesses of climate impacts. These are feasible for warming up to 1.5 degrees C. You can see the examples here. For instance, enhanced health services for water, sanitation, and health, adaptation planning, such as disaster risk management with early warning systems that reduces climate risk for societies, livelihoods, and economies. For energy supplies and land, water and food, these effective transformational adaptation options include enhanced efficiency of water use, resilient power systems that are reliable, and protecting and restoring terrestrial and marine ecosystems. The point here is that feasible, effective, and low-cost options for integrated adaptation and mitigation are already available. So that's the summary of the current state of play for the AR6 assessment. I don't want to end on a bad note, so I'm going to pass over to my co-chair right now, Bart Hurk, for his take, or for our take, on what lies ahead for AR7. Over to you, Bart.
But we can't hear you. You mute your microphone.
Yeah.
Sorry for this. Thank you for the warning. As Winston Chow already demonstrated, in AR6 it was a very influential report, also because there were so many options revealed and investigated, also for their potential for scaling up. And I think AR7 is going to build on that in a few dimensions a bit more even. One of the elements that we all also, of course, see that it is implementation of actions is not a trivial task. There's many barriers and enablers that make action possible. And for instance, there's barriers and enablers in the technological domain, in the environmental, ecological domain. We have to look at economical enablers or barriers, at governance barriers. We look at societal and governance barriers, and some of them are also listed on the cartoon that you see on the right-hand side of this slide, where societal trust in governance, in the degree to which beliefs are shared, the degree to which technology is shared, they all are part of the solution space. And AR7 is intended to dive a bit deeper into that domain. In addition, if you go to the next slide, Winston Chow also alluded to the fact that more success is guaranteed when adaptation and mitigation go together in the implementation of actions, and there is more potential for scaling up. But that is not the only, say, mixture or synergy that we need to take into account. In many operational decision-making contexts, there is some kind of a trade-off is present. A lot of actions that are needed to take measures for the long term, they do involve changes at the short term that may not be felt as a beneficial for the short term. So some kind of a trade-off between different types of solutions needs to be elaborated,
we need to make trade-offs sometimes between territories or regions or so, which area is maybe changed or is taken action at a different pace than another or something like that. And also in time between generations that are here. The current generation has to take actions to also keep options open for the future generation. If you go to the next slide, Winston, this calls for a lot more, say, systemic analysis to really dive into the real trouble or the real art, I could say, of implementation of actions. We do need to appreciate that there is no such strict boundaries between what we call working groups in that decision environment. There's lots of synergies necessary and can be addressed in between our working groups. For instance, the synergy between working group 1 and 2 is if we go to the climate assessments, and then for sure when we go to climate impact assessment. It is typically a domain where the two working groups go hand in hand. Also, the adaptation policies are requesting very specific scenario information to adjust to their policies. And again, that calls for more synchronization and collaboration between working group 1 and 2. Of course, between working group 2 and 3 is when you think about taking actions in either the adaptation or the mitigation domain. In many decision contexts, these two come together, and that has to be appreciated by also a much more cross-working group analysis of where the options are, where the actions are, and how they actually engage either or both the adaptation and mitigation. And then obviously between work group 1 and 3, there is traditionally already a very strong linkage by an analysis of what the climate impacts are or far spread mitigation and vice versa. So that integration will receive a lot of attention for the next cycle as well. On the next slide, we already make a bit of an announcement of the first special report that we will produce in this cycle, which was already decided on in an earlier cycle and is now going to be scoped in April. We are talking about with a country that is probably going to host the meeting, and we expect to be releasing the date and venue very early. But there is of course a lot of interest to look at the climate change and cities special report from all kinds of organizations, not only scientific organizations or policy-making organizations, but also NGOs, industry, local governments are very interested, of course, in this topic. This, again, as a typical special report, this is requiring a lot of integration between the different working groups. So we will indeed jointly organize the whole the scoping and the outline of the report. Working group 2 will carry the administrative or organizational coordination, but this is a cross-working group entity. We have formed a steering committee that, of course, has co-chairs from all work groups and vice-chairs from all working groups that jointly prepare currently the scoping meeting for this first report that will come out. Tomorrow morning, there will be a dedicated session to dive a bit deeper into this special report on climate change and cities. And please, if you go to the next slide, I think I'm wrapping up. For this special report, the call for nomination, of course, has been already went out for the scoping meeting. We've asked for a very wide range of domain expertise, which if going into the city area, we require a lot of information on the physical constructions, on the design of cities, on the governance of cities, of the footprint of cities, all kinds of cycles in cities. So that calls for a wide diversity in experimental and experience. We also do a call on transdisciplinary integration. So not only the scientists are invited for the scoping meeting, but also policymakers and practitioners. And we are trying to develop a generic narrative for the special report already at the scoping, that we are trying to formulate a story or an outlook to where action-oriented assessments can indeed help cities and society at large to cope with the consequences of climate change or to contribute to mitigating its extent. And the outcome of this scoping meeting will, as usual, be endorsed by the panel meeting, and that is planned around summer. That will be the 61st panel meeting. And I think that was what I would like to present, and I hand over back to the chair of the session. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, Bart and Winston. We note that the risks increase with every increment of warming, but feasible adaptation options are available. That's the good news. And also we note from the AR6 perspectives, we note your vision, action-oriented focus, and as well as the cross-working group arrangements that you plan to put in place. And with that note, I would like to now hand over to Working Group 3 co-chairs to bring and share their perspective. And I would like to invite Dr. Katherine Calvin and Dr. Xiaoye Pereira. Katherine is going to present from here, whereas Xiaoye is connected online and she will share the presentation as we move.
Yeah,
Over to you.
Thank you so much. And so as mentioned, Xiaoye and I are going to do this presentation jointly. We're going to take a similar approach to the previous working group, and I will start by presenting highlights from AR6, along with some context around recent developments and discussions. And then I'll turn it over to Xiaoye to talk a little bit more about where we're going forward in AR7. And so what I'm going to do is give you a quick tour of the Working Group 3 contribution to the 6th Assessment Report by walking through each of the SPM figures. So the first, global net anthropogenic emissions have continued to rise across all major groups of greenhouse gases. Average annual greenhouse gas emissions were higher between 2010 and 2019 than any previous decade, but the rate of growth between 2010 and 2019 was lower than that of the decade before. So we're seeing, this is the state of the emissions today. We're seeing those increases in greenhouse gas emissions across all major sectors globally. We've also looked at regional contributions to emissions and found that regional contributions to global greenhouse gas emissions continue to differ widely. The variations in regional and national per capita emissions partly reflect different development stages, but they also vary widely at similar income levels. And while global emissions have risen, we are seeing some declines in some countries. So there are at least 18 countries that have sustained greenhouse gas emissions reductions for longer than 10 years. Continuing on the trend of progress, the Working Group 3 AR6 report also showed changes in cost and adoption of several key technologies. And what they found is that the unit costs of some forms of renewable energy and batteries for passenger electric vehicles have fallen. And that's the top row here. We're looking at costs over time over the last 20 years. And you see declines, particularly with photovoltaics and batteries for passenger electric vehicles. In the bottom part of this chart, we're looking at adoption over that same time frame. And what you're seeing along with those cost declines is also a rapid adoption of these technologies. And so we are seeing progress towards adopting renewable energy and electrification of passenger transport. We're also seeing a consistent expansion of policies and laws addressing mitigation since AR5. So AR5 was published in 2014, and so we've seen an expansion of these policies and laws. However, projected global greenhouse gas emissions from NDCs announced prior to COP26 would make it likely that warming will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius and also make it harder after 2030 to limit warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. And that is what this figure is showing. It's showing global greenhouse gas emissions, including trends from implemented policies, as well as pathways that limit warming to 2 degrees, those are in green, or 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot, that's in blue. The purple line is showing pathways that include continuation and implementation of NDCs through 2030 before reaching, going towards lower warming levels beyond that period. I will note that this assessment was based on NDCs announced prior to COP26. We are now at COP28, so just to keep that in mind, that is what was considered there. And this has to do with the timing of the publication of the Working Group 3 report, as well as the literature cutoff. The one other thing I'd like to mention here before I move to the next slide is about fossil fuel infrastructure. So there was an assessment both in Working Group 3 as well as in the synthesis report about the projected carbon dioxide emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructure. And what the synthesis report found is that projected carbon dioxide emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructure without additional abatement would exceed the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius. And as I mentioned, the Working Group 3 report was published 18 months ago, and it's based on literature that was published more than 2 years ago. And so that estimate does not include any changes in infrastructure since that point in time. Working Group 3 did do an assessment of what it would take to limit warming to 1.5 and 2 degrees. And this figure, which I'll walk through since there's a lot of lines on there in a second, it's showing modeled mitigation pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. They all involve deep, rapid, and sustained emissions reductions. So what you're seeing here in the top left is global greenhouse gas emissions. In the top right, net global carbon dioxide emissions. And in the bottom row, we're seeing methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions. And so this is showing you the pathways with the same colors in the previous one. So you're getting these pathways that limit warming to 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees in the purple and blue. And so you see these deep, rapid, and sustained emissions reductions in those pathways. The AR6 also noted that those reductions, those rapid and deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are on all sectors, and that global net zero carbon dioxide emissions are reached in 1.5 degree pathways with no or limited overshoot in the early 2050s. So not that far in the future from now. The Working Group 3 and synthesis report also did an assessment by sector. So there's a chapter on each sector within the Working Group 3 report and a summary for policymaker bullet that goes through mitigation in each of those sectors. And I'm not going to go through each of them here today, but I'll just highlight in the energy sector. The assessment says that reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the full energy sector requires a major energy transitions, including a substantial reduction in overall fossil fuel use, the deployment of low emissions energy sources, switching to alternative energy carriers, and energy efficiency and conservation. They also noted that the continued installation of unabated fossil fuel infrastructure would lock in greenhouse gas emissions. And I will note that there is a definition of unabated in there for that particular context, and it has to do with the amount of carbon captured. So noting that without substantial, unabated means without substantial reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And all of those technical details are in the Working Group 3 report. These are based on modeled pathways, and in the AR6, we focused on global results there. There is a box in the summary for policymakers that provides context around these pathways, including the modeling approaches and equity assumptions. And as Jim mentioned earlier on, since the publication of the AR6, there has been a workshop on scenarios that led to recommendations for both the IPCC and the science community on the pathway forward for these modeled pathways. I now want to talk a little bit about some of the options for reducing emissions. And this figure is showing demand-side mitigation. So Working Group 3, for the first time, assessed demand-side mitigation and noted that this can be achieved through changes in sociocultural factors, infrastructure design and use, and end-use technology adoption by 2050. And so this figure is showing this in a few different areas. So showing the mitigation potential in the left in the food system, in the middle in industry, land transport, and buildings, and in the right on electricity. And so looking at what those demand-side options are and what the mitigation potential is. In addition to looking at demand, Working Group 3 also looked across all sectors and noted some of the mitigation options there. And this is the full figure here, but I'm going to zoom in so you can see it a little better. But what we found was that there are many options available now in all sectors that can offer substantial potential to reduce net emissions by 2030. The costs and potentials do vary across countries. This assessment is global, but we do note that it varies across countries, and it would also vary in the longer term. This is focused on 2030, but some of what you see is large contributions of mitigation potential can come from solar and wind energy, energy efficiency improvements, reduced conversion of natural ecosystems, and methane emissions reductions. The last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Joy to talk about the future is that we also looked at how mitigation options interact with the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are many options that have synergies with Sustainable Development Goals, but some options can also have trade-offs. And those synergies and trade-offs vary dependent on context and scale. And so when you look at this figure, I'll zoom in on this one too so you can see it a little bit better. You can look across a row at a single option and see how it interacts with the different Sustainable Development Goals. And so there are some options like reduced food loss and waste that have synergies with many SDGs. There are other options that have a mix of synergies and trade-offs. You can also look down a column and look for an individual SDG and see what each mitigation option, how that impacts those SDGs. So for example, if you look at SDG 3, which is on good health and well-being, you'll find that there are many mitigation actions that would have benefits through health, through lower air pollution, active mobility, and shifts to sustainable healthy diets. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Joy.
Thank you, Kate. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In the last cycle, I was the Vice Chair of Working Group 2, and I intend to use the experience that I gained from the last cycle to build bridges between the working groups. As Co-Chair Kate mentioned, where she highlighted the synergies and trade-offs of mitigation options and sustainable development goals. In the AR6 cycle, the authors also reported with high confidence that near-term mitigation and adaptation actions have more synergies than trade-offs with the SDGs. So this pretty much depends on the pace and magnitude of change and the development context. Trade-offs can be evaluated and minimized by giving emphasis to capacity building, finance, governance, and technology transfer, investment, development, context-specific, and gender-based, as well as other social equity considerations, and meaningful participation of all stakeholders. And this is something we need to look to explore further and work on in the coming AR7 cycle. In this figure, which was also shared by Working Group Co-Chair Winston Chow, where he highlighted multiple opportunities for scaling up climate action, I draw your attention to panel A on the left, which presents selected adaptation and mitigation options across different systems covering energy supply, land, water and food, settlements and infrastructure, among others. Climate responses and adaptation options, along with their synergies with mitigation, have been assessed for their multi-dimensional feasibility at global scale in the near term and up to 1.5 degree global warming. Do take note of the higher number of darker colored boxes in all sectors, which indicate high to moderate levels of feasibility and synergies between adaptation and mitigation. So in the AR7 cycle, we need to have more practical and yet scientifically sound knowledge on mitigation and its integration with adaptation, including the techno-economic nexus and interactions across geographic typologies, as well as social governance, resource, and capacity in different societies. Next slide, please. In the AR7, we also need to expand the sector to cover oceans so that we have sound scientific knowledge of the feasibility and synergies between mitigation and adaptation in oceans. The upcoming special report on climate change and cities offers us a great opportunity to get scientific insights on integrating mitigation, adaptation, and indeed disaster risk reduction at the local level. I now hand the floor back to Kate to wrap up with her take on the AR7. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. And I just want to... Just to conclude, I want to emphasize something that I think you've probably heard from most of us on this panel, that we're really looking forward to more integration across working groups and also with the task force on inventories and a broader range of authors and literature in AR7. And with that, I turn it back to the...
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. We note from this presentation the urgent, rapid, and deep emission reductions to stay within 1.52 degree. Like for working group, the focus that focus on adaptation, the mitigation options, feasible ones, are available, and with synergies with sustainable development goals and adaptation, which is yet again the focus for the AR7 for working group 3, along with more efforts that are planned to be put in place for integration with other working group work. And with that, we are now moving to the other part of the program, which is the question and answer session. I think we are doing well with time. Before I open the floor for questions, I would like to note that we will be moving with a microphone for the people who want to ask questions. Please be focused on the questions that you are going to make. We only have now 29 minutes left. Introduce yourself, your name, institution, or the country where you come from. And if you have a very clear idea who you want the question to be answered, otherwise we are going to direct it to the available panelists. So please, the UNFCCC Secretariat colleagues, yes. Now I open the floor. So I'll take questions in batches, two to three questions, and then we'll, based on the time availability, we will go from one round to another one. So I'll start with you. Sorry, I don't know some people, so I'll... Okay. Yeah, this is what I... So you have two microphones. I wasn't aware of that. Sorry.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this great presentation. I really appreciate it. My name is Magdalena Davis. I represent an NGO society, People in Need. That is mainly a humanitarian organization, but it also does a lot of climate smart agriculture and other adaptation, mitigation work in over 42 countries in the world. And I'm particularly interested in what you have presented here as trying to basically get the scientific message and communicate it to the policymakers and the businesses. If I understood correctly, maybe there's more people responsible, but Professor Skea was responsible for that area, like trying to convey what the business should probably hear. And I was interested in what is your strategy. Maybe it's a question for other people as well, but I think the answer often lays in that area of business. Thank you.
Okay, I'll collect two more questions.
Can you hear me? Yes? Oh. My name is Tamara Lawrence. I'm with the Climate Action Network Canada. And I applaud the IPCC very much on its work. I've been following since 2001, the third assessment report. I wanted to just let you know that over the past 10 years, we have sent letters to the UNFCCC Secretariat to invite the IPCC to do a special report on military emissions and emissions from war and from conflict. And I just want to make this appeal to you directly. To do this. In the emissions gap report that just came out, for the very first time, it said that military emissions are non-trivial, are non-trivial, but the IPCC has never explored this. And then finally, in closing, I just want to say, being from Canada, you mentioned about the forest fires that devastated our country this year. I mean, it's very terrifying, but do you know, the Canadian government this year announced $74 billion for a new fleet of fossil fuel-powered fighter jets, $3 billion for fossil fuel-powered strategic tankers, and $38 billion to militarize our Arctic for our new fighter jets and our new warships. So the issue of military emissions, war emissions, can no longer be ignored. And I just want to make this special appeal for you to focus on this, because we cannot adapt and mitigate if we are not dealing with this issue. And then maybe one last thing is, in the 6th assessment report, your final paragraph said international cooperation is the crucial enabler to ambitious climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. International cooperation means peace and us stop fighting with each other. We've got to end the wars. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Richard Jones at the Met Office Hadley Centre. This is a question that is specifically to the Working Group 2 co-chairs. In terms of enabling action, there is an enormous amount of activity in terms of adaptation practice around the world. A lot of the monitoring and evaluation and learning from that is sitting in grey literature. What is is there going to be a strategy for being able to synthesize all of that learning so that we can close the gap between adaptation, action and assessment of of the learning from and good practices on adaptation?
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we are going to get questions 3 by 3, so we better move to the answers. And we have the question on the business sector, military emissions, and on the Working Group 2, the cities-related one. So we'll start with the chair responding to the first, and
I'll say something about both the
first and the second, yeah,
first, second,
and then Working Group 2
yeah.
co-chairs.
Yeah. Okay. So on the business side, I mean, I was, along with my colleague Professor Shukla from Ahmedabad, I was co-chair of Working Group 3 in the last cycle, and we actually made systematic efforts to engage with the business community during the reports, including by running webinars during the review periods. And we used for that interaction, we essentially interacted with the International Chamber of Commerce. We have limited bandwidth, obviously, so we chose an obvious organisation that was coordinating the bingos, the business and industry NGOs through the convention. So I think it's, whether Working Group 3 wants to carry that on is up to the new leadership there. I should say that it wasn't just the bingos that we engaged with. We also engaged with the environmental NGOs as well. And it was actually Climate Action Network that was our partner there for engagement, which takes me neatly over to the second question about the military side. Now, just to flag up, we have a list of potential special report topics that it would cover a sheet of A4 at the moment that we need to address. We have limited bandwidth within IPCC, so we will need to consider that extremely carefully. I would flag up one other issue on military emissions is, do we have anything to assess in terms of information? Because the very problem that's been alluded to is that the information is not really available to look at. So I think I do need to manage expectations on that one, and I'll finish there, Ermira.
Thank you, Jim. And I'd like now to invite Winston to...
Thanks, Ermira. Good question, Richard. Fully agree with you. There is a wealth of important, policy-relevant and applicable information from grey literature, and using the example of urban literature that I'm very comfortable in and will be focused on for the special report on climate change and cities. There are so many effective heat action plans, for instance, from a variety of cities, Ahmedabad, from Paris, from a lot of East Asian cities that deal with reducing heat risks and vulnerability to a very high degree, but they are not published in scientific, the peer-reviewed scientific literature for now. Hopefully there will be a push towards that over the next couple of years to make that eligible for assessment. But further to that, there are existing guidelines and procedures for analyzing and assessing grey literature. And given the fact that these particular sources of information at that subnational scale, at the urban scale, are so relevant, we have to find a way to include them with the high quality control that is needed for a robust assessment of this sort of very policy-relevant literature. One thing I would point out that several, my co-chair colleagues and I, particularly in Working Group 1, we are kind of enthused and potentially excited about how the use of AI technologies can potentially aid with the assessment of this great literature, especially for those that are published in non-English languages, which are a very big, important source of this policy-relevant information. So watch this particular space. I hope that there can be an advancement in applying these tools that can help authors in this assessment in AR7.
Thank you, Winston. And now I open the session for another round of questions.
That side, please.
Okay. 1, 2, 3.
Good evening and namaste. I am Borsa Parazuli from Nepal and working with Clean Energy Nepal. I would like to extend the special applause to the IPCC team for the presentations and the report. What are my concerns are like mountains are especially sensitive to climate change and we all are aware of this. But then these emissions do also have a differential impact on mountainous areas. So with the existing data gaps, there is a massive need of research and capacity development. So will that be possible that we could have some special chapters on mountains? Because when we have the chapters for cities, then why don't we have such chapters for mountains that are more vulnerable to the emission? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry. So thank you very much. My name is Alexandra Depré. I'm a researcher at a think tank based in Paris called IDRI. And my question was regarding perhaps, well, I had two very related questions. The first was, you spoke, Jim, about the fact that there is already one special report and perhaps space for another one. So I wanted to confirm if there's space for only one more, or in addition to the methodological report on short-lived forcers. And in relation to that, I was also curious, and in relation to the negotiations, as you know, the whole question of unabated and abated fossil fuel phase-out is coming up. And Kate, you pointed out that there is a definition in IPCC Working Group 3 SPM, but in fact, the scientists that put together that definition, Chris Bataille, or helped in that, he published another paper more recently showing that Paris-compliant definition of abated fossil fuels is actually stricter than that. So in light of the negotiations and the need to not leave open an ambiguity that could be perhaps too wide, I was wondering if it would be possible for the IPCC to develop a definition in AR7, and if the UNFCCC could invite the IPCC to do that. Thank you.
You need a microphone. Yeah, please. So while you can keep one microphone here and one...
Thank you very much. I'm Maciej Sokołowski. I'm a professor at Keio University, Japan, although I come from Poland. So I have real questions, not statements. So could you elaborate a bit on the selection process when it comes to the special report, the number of candidates, some deadlines, and the last but not least, how important the previous experience in working with IPCC is? Whether you welcome new authors, and could you just use like a previous experience, for instance, whether the new authors represent, I don't know, 10% of the team, or 50% or 40%, something like this. Thank you very much.
So let's move to the answers.
Excuse me, there is a question for the virtual speaker that he would like to raise?
Okay, I know that, but let's respond to these 3 questions as I have noted previously. So there is a question on mountain chapters, on the fossil fuels definition, and the authors. So I would then hand over to on the mountains, maybe working group 2, and if others may wish to.
I think I can give a quick answer to the assessment of mountain areas. It's critical. We know that they are extremely vulnerable, as I mentioned in my presentation. We did cover that in AR6 with some of the work in SROC, and also in Working Group 2 in AR6 there was a particular cross-chapter paper 5 which dealt with a lot of the impacts, adaptation and vulnerability issues. So we are aware of how particularly important those regions are. As for looking into particular special reports, I think Jim has mentioned that there's a process involved in that. If that is raised, then we'll consider that particular issue. To answer that question about selection, about special reports, if I could do so. For the cities report, the nominations were put out. I mean, the ad was, the announcement for the nominations was put out in November. It was recently closed. We received a lot of nominations for scoping experts, which I think speaks to the, when Bart was mentioning the scoping, in his presentation, the immense interest in terms of the particular assessment on climate change and cities. The steering committee, the scientific steering committee led by Diana, we are in the process of looking through the list of experts. We take note the importance of expertise, of the background from a geographical region, also for gender and other important issues of equity. We also note that we have a balance between people who have experience with the IPCC process, but also people who have new things to contribute. There has to be that, we need to make sure that fresh inputs are included in this cycle in scoping the particular aspect for any special report, including one of our cities. So hopefully that answers that particular question. And I think we will come to a conclusion about invitations for these scoping experts early next year or thereabouts, by the end, hopefully by the end of January. So watch this particular space.
Thank you. Thank you. Now on the fossil fuels definition, I see.
Yeah, look, I'm actually going to. Will I take that just for a second and pass it back to Kate again? Because there was also questions about special reports, and actually, bizarrely, this touches on the question of abatement. So, just to say, we have done an extensive lessons learned exercise from the last cycle, and there was a very strong conclusion that the cycle was congested and nearly broke the work of some of the technical support units. And more than that, it also meant that we sacrificed other kinds of activities like expert meetings, which we did not do enough of to open up new topics. So this needs to be taken account of very carefully in thinking what we do. Now, we don't know whether it's one other special report or another. It's up to governments to decide it in January, but they will be receiving clear messages from the scientists involved in IPCC about what is possible. Now, the reason that touches on abatement or unabated or whatever is that some governments have also made a suggestion that the inventory guidelines on carbon capture and storage should be updated because they were last done in 2006, and about 80% of the CCS literature has been published since then. And so I think this is something that does need to be considered and would capture, if it were done, some of the abatement and unabated issues and all the controversies. But over to Kate, I think, there.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. I just wanted to note that, so first of all, the IPCC has a very different mandate than the UNFCCC. Our job is to assess the scientific literature and to communicate it clearly and precisely. And so we're very careful about each word we use, making sure it's defined and clear. And so I noted that we had defined unabated in that context because it's that definition is relevant to that sentence, and you have to interpret that sentence with that context in mind. You mentioned some recent literature. So the Working Group 3 contribution to AR6 was published in March of 2022. It had a literature cutoff of October of 2021. And so we have not assessed any literature published since then, but our role in AR7 is to assess all of that literature that's happened since 2021, as well as all the papers you guys might write in the coming years.
Thank you, Kate. And before we move to the next round of questions, I just wanted to invite the other co-chairs who are connected online. I want to acknowledge Robert, who has raised his hand, but for the others, even though I don't see the raised hand, if they want to, yes, I see now Joy and
Bart.
Yeah, Joy and Bart for now. Bart, you have the floor. Sorry, I see Robert first. Robert, Bart, and Joy.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I just wanted to give the figure for new author, which is actually 63% new authors in Working Group 1 in AR6 in last cycle. I think it's a good balance. So I also wanted to give another thought on the previous question on mountains. Of course, we have to do even better than what we've done in 86, with more regional description, for sure. And also, I wanted to give just a thought on these questions of literature. We think that in the last 10 years or 15 years, there has been a lot of national reports or regional reports that we have taken to take into account. There are excellent quality made by local people, local scientists who know their climate. It's important to include that, so we want to find a way to maintain a network of scientists throughout the cycle. This is something to think of how to do that more precisely. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you, Robert. Now I hand it back to Joy.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I just wanted to touch on the question on new authors. I want to highlight that there are many ways to engage with the IPCC. One, either via your national focal points, which is listed in the IPCC website, or you can wait for the call for review and become an expert reviewer, and from your comments get selected as a contributing author. So it is not restrictive that you have to wait to be selected for an author. So please look out for the calls in the IPCC website. Thank you.
Thank you, Joey. And now I'd like to hand over to Bart, if you would like to make any remarks or add anything.
Well, thank you. I propose to use the time to get more questions. My answer was pretty similar to what Joy just announced.
Thank you for the flexibility. With 7 minutes left to end the event, I think we can only go for one more question, and then I have to hand it over to the chair for the closing remarks. And then I would like to invite everyone to come and visit us at our pavilion, where you can ask questions directly to the IPCC leaders. And with that, then we have to close. So I'll go for one more question. Ala? I try to do justice. It's very difficult. This is one of the most difficult jobs of the moderator. Please bear with me. without an electronic system, and I cannot find out who was first. Apologies.
Thanks a lot, Ermira. I feel like I won the lottery. Ala Al-Kordaji, I'm a research fellow at Imperial College London. So the co-chairs collectively talked about collaboration across all working groups. My question is, how are you going to do this in practice? And I appreciate that this perhaps something for the panel as well to decide on, but what are your views? Is it shared chapters, shared authors? How are you going to put this in practice? Particularly if we think about AR6 and the pressure that the authors went under, especially in the emulator workflow between working group 1 and working group 3. And so the dedicated team would help a lot reducing that pressure in AR7. Thank you.
Whoever would like to, I'm not going to finger point. And I also note the online, yes, Robert and Bart. Who wants?
I can start quickly first. So yes, agreed. There was a lot of complications with cross-working group activities in AR6, not complicated further by COVID. But there were some good starts happening. I can give examples of, let's say, the cross-working group box on urban areas, which I think was a great start where we coordinated across working groups 1, 2, and 3 to deliver a pretty decent box that integrated the urban issues, which will be one of the things that will bring about in AR7 and for the special report on cities. I think Bart will have some things to say about the very interesting TSU-related work that can help practically bring this integration together. It's one thing to talk about it, but it's another thing to bring that into action. Can I bring Bart into the discussion now, very quickly?
Maybe Kate, and then we go online if she doesn't.
No, I'll just go quickly. I mean, I think at this stage we're in the brainstorming phase, and right now the 6 of us co-chairs speak very regularly, and we're trying to come up with ways that we can integrate. We saw a lot of great starts in AR6, and we want to continue that in AR7.
Thank you, Kate. Bart? Bart, over to you.
I can only second earlier interventions, but I think it would be great. It's not up to us, of course, to scope the reports, but it would be great if the reports are being scoped jointly and that specific attention is also paid to, as much as possible, cross-working group sections or boxes. I think the AR6 gave a nice illustration of how profitable it can be, and it only takes us for more. And also part of that exercise is to set out, say, clear narratives of the overall cycle very early in the process, that we have a joint narrative developed across the working groups. That also helped. And I also call to the entire community that I think it's necessary to also discipline ourselves in the assessments. We really would like to push back to the ever-increasing size of the working group reports. Or actually all the assessment reports, and we really would like to focus on that information that can really make a difference in action-oriented decision-making. That's easier said than done, but it also calls, I think, on both the scoping and the author onboarding processes, and that has a lot of our attention.
Thank you, Bart. And I hand over to Robert. You have only 30 seconds, I'm afraid, then I have to give floor to the chair to give his closing remarks.
Everything basically has been said that I wanted to say, but maybe one more thing that I think all of us had this priority to make a team of co-chairs actually, and work together. We work together on papers. We work together on shaping whatever we can shape and which is in our remit. And there's an excellent ambience. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And with that, I would like to invite the chair of IPCC to, I'm sorry, Anna, I have only 2 minutes to close, and it's a live stream. So I would like to invite Jim to give his closing remarks. So, Jim, you have, I'm afraid, not more than 1 minute to...
Okay. Ermira's pointing to the great attention to timekeeping that we have started to introduce into the 7th cycle. So I hope you can see that there's an energetic and a talented team that's leading IPCC for this cycle. I'm really pleased to work with them. I mean, on the vice chairs, first of all, the risk of having the word vice in your job title is that you have nothing to do. And I hope you can see from Diana's presentation, they probably feel they have too many jobs to do at the moment. They're going to be busy, they are energetic, and just to say the process has already started, for example, interaction with other groups here at COP28. On the co-chairs, I am delighted by the fact that they are working together so well and collaborating together. It's been very, very obvious. And also pleased about the messages about an action-oriented approach that will help us with policy relevance and engagement with major stakeholders. 45 seconds to go. I have got the other last thing I want to comment is just the big challenges that we face in this cycle. It is governments who will make the final decision about which reports we produce or which other kinds of products like technical papers. But we do need to manage expectations there about what can be achieved by a relatively small number of people. I would like to flag up that there are now around 45,000 papers published a year on climate change, and the number doubles with every cycle. So the number of papers in the 6th cycle was the sum of all the papers that had been previously been published. We need to think about our workload and how we manage that very effectively. And I can see the grins on the side of me from my Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 co-chairs to the right-hand side. But just to say, I think we're all looking for an impactful, productive, enjoyable cycle, and I actually hope that we all end up friends at the end of it as much as we were friends at the end of the previous cycle. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks to the team of vice chairs, the team of co-chairs, and to everyone that contributed. And also I'd like to again thank Diana, the vice chair, who was the coordinator for this event. And I know there are many questions that you may wish to ask, but